I'm Amanda Pickett. I'm a consultant at the State Education Resource Center. Just to give you a quick snapshot of who I am and what I do, I'm a social worker by training and trade. I do a lot of work at CERC around infusing whole student wellness in really all that we do. So how do we look at behavior, social, emotional learning, mental health needs of students and infuse it into our multi-tiered system of supports? How do we help students with disabilities? How do we reach out to families and communities? And how do we change our systems? So that's really my mantra at CERC and what I do. But I have the luxury of working with a colleague.
So good afternoon. My name is Nicole Vitale. I'm also with the State Education Resource Center. And I do work around culturally responsive pedagogy, leadership, and equity. And I also work with youth across the state around leadership, equity, and diversity. And I run our Special Education Youth Advisory Council as well, which if you want more information about that, you can come see me after, because we're running it again next year.
Just a quick raise of hands. Teachers, administrators, support staff, counselors, social workers, psychologists, any para, classroom aides, instructional assistants. Who did I miss? Okay, well, I know who you are. You have a nice state advocate here in the room. That's what I'm going to call you. Perfect. So all the strategies that we are going to be working through today and the rest of the afternoon are things that we want you to take back. So share with your colleagues, even some of the activities that we do. It's about how can we take the skills and information that we are presenting and you take it back and do it in your classrooms, in your schools, in your districts. So that is our hope today. So what are we going to look at? First, we're going to think about what are the critical features of a multi-tiered system of support, and then how do we integrate culturally and contextually fit practices within those systems. So how do we assure that we are aligning things instead of it being the next checkbox of we've done this, we've done that, but really looking at integrating and aligning what we're doing with our supports. And then we're going to give you some tools and strategies that hopefully you can take back and look at your own self-reflective practice, but also look with your colleagues. Does that sound good to folks? I'm going to plug again the website. So today's PowerPoint, along with the activities and the video, I'm going to post up there as well. So please make sure you go onto the website and feel free to share that with your colleagues. So that is a website you can share with others.
So I know it says ground rules up there, but we want to talk a little bit about group norms, which are a little bit different than rules, because rules are something we would come into this space with that Amanda and I would say, this is what we want to see in this space. But we want to create some ground norms, ground rules for things that you feel you value in order to create a safe space. So one of the things that we think creates a safe space is to respect the speaker. So if one person is speaking, we don't have somebody else speaking at the same time. And one of the important things about norms, right, which one of the reasons I use it while I'm working with students is because in order to be culturally responsive, we want students to be able to contribute to setting what those norms are for what they think is important. Sometimes students will say, eye contact is really important. But for some other students, eye contact is not something that is acceptable or that they feel comfortable with, right? So if we said eye contact, maybe not everybody in this space would feel comfortable with that. So we want to set up some norms that you feel comfortable with as a group. If you went to another room, that might change because you'd be with different people, right? So what do you need in this space outside of one speaker at a time for us to have a safe space to have a conversation? Yeah.
Non-judgmental. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. Okay. Saw a hand back there. Confidentiality. Perfect.
And non-judgmental would also include nobody judging my spelling, right?
So think about this morning, Diane mentioned that having conversations around race and culture for many folks is uncomfortable. So how do we make this a safe space for people? It's really what we want to think about. How do we make this a safe space for us to engage in more challenging conversations? Be courageous, but empathetic. I like that. Be courageous, but empathetic. And non-judgmental. Open-minded. So I think a really important adaptation, if you are taking this back with working with students, is thinking about having observable kind of definitions of what these things mean. So we're all on the same page about what is open-minded, what is non-judgmental. We're not going to kind of break this activity all the way down, but thinking about, we often use large terms or things like we all think we're on the same page about this. We all know what respect is. Respect is different. So ensuring that we are coming up with some real examples of what we mean by those terms.
Mm-hmm. And the other benefit of the norms is that based on us going through the conversation and through the afternoon, if we feel that something's up here that isn't working for our group, we can go back and we can take it off or we can add to it, right? It's kind of fluid. The norms are kind of fluid.
So I was at our racism conference, was that 2 weeks ago now? And a woman shared this slide that I thought was great. So we didn't want to come in here with our expectations already up, but if you're having a hard time generating a list from folks, or if you're looking for making sure there's some pieces that you want to make sure get up on the board, because sometimes we naturally kind of plant some seeds in some folks to ensure they get up on our norms list, thinking about respect, openness, perspectives, honoring multiple perspectives and experiences, safety, and then some strategies around using I statements. So it does become about your own experience and shaping them in those ways, taking risks, seek first to understand, then to be understood. So we're looking for relationships and communication and understanding where folks are coming from, and intent versus impact. Oftentimes when you're having conversations specifically around race, there can be those oops or ouch rules, and thinking about how do we move past those and ensure a safe space.
Oh, you took it off. Okay. All right. So initially this was going to be like a poll everywhere, but we didn't get that. We didn't get that going. So what we want you to do is we want you to take a second and just think of what words come to mind when you think of the word culture. Would anyone like to share? Yes. Religion.
Tradition. Beliefs. Environment. Differences. Roles.
Mm-hmm.
Practices. Thank you.
Anyone else?
All right, let's see.
So culture it's all of these things. And with culture, right, what do we know about icebergs in general? Right, there's a huge chunk, 90% of the iceberg is underwater, right? So 90% of our culture, our beliefs and our attitudes are kind of under the surface, that deep part of culture. On the surface, those are things you can generally see, right? So I know it's hard to read, but like Amanda said, this will be up on the website, so you'll be able to see this. But so food, flags, festivals, arts and crafts, language, and language a lot of times is in both surface and deep level culture, right? Some of the things below the surface that you don't generally know, attitudes towards elders, notions of courtesy and manners, personal space, those types of things. Those are things that you wouldn't necessarily know culturally about someone unless you got to know them a little bit better, unless you took time to get to know them. And sometimes we're not even aware ourselves of the things that our beliefs and those types of things until we take a step back and we really look at them, right? Because there's a lot of things that we sometimes do that we don't know what drives us to do those things, right? So in the last group, I gave an example that for me, culturally, I cook dinner for my husband almost every night. For me, that's really important. So I cook dinner, I get dinner ready, I put it on the table, and some people look at me, and one of the other groups, what did the woman say? I'm not a feminist, right? And so, but for me, that's what I grew up with. And that's really important to me. And people look at that like, oh, you're serving your husband, you should do this. But for me, I enjoy doing that. It's what I saw my grandmother do. It's what I saw my mother do. And it's who I am. And it's not something I intend to change or want to change. But people not knowing me as a person, they wouldn't know that that's part of my deep culture. They would only see that on the surface, right? If they didn't get to know who I was, right? So just take a second and think for yourself. Maybe some of the things that people don't necessarily know about you, but they might think they know about you just because they see it on the surface.
So I think that's value, and that could also be under the identification of culture.
Right.
Not?
Yeah.
Sorry. That's fine. That's fine. Yep. So adding values.
Values. Absolutely. I use this when I'm working with students, and I tend to do an activity with them, and I say to them, so on the surface, what do you see? You see me, right? What assumptions, what generalizations, stereotypes, what do you see when you look at me, right? And they generally say I'm like 24 to 28, which I really appreciate, right? So then when I tell them I'm much older, they tell me I must moisturize really well. That's really a true story. And so, but I do, and I ask them, like, what kind of music do I listen to, right? Who do you think I am racially, ethnically, those types of things, you know? And they come up with all of these extravagant things, and then I kind of give them a breakdown of who I am and how, with the deep culture, how I got to be the person that I am, right? So this is definitely something that you can even do with your students and bring this back to your schools.
Definitions here, just to ensure that we are all on the same page, which I think we are. Looking at, again, values, beliefs, behavior that is typically passed down from generation to generation. I want us all to really pay attention to this last quote. It is not possible to be truly sensitive to someone else's culture until one is sensitive to one's own culture and the impact that cultural customs, values, beliefs, and behaviors have on practice. So I think oftentimes folks are afraid to hold up the mirror on themselves. That's the first step. We have to be willing to think about, what are my beliefs? What are my values? What are my customs? What are my traditions? And how does that impact, how does that impact how I interact with others? And oftentimes we don't do that until there's a difference, and that causes conflict. So usually we're not doing that until we're in a moment of conflict. So we need to be ready to do it proactively and peel the layers back on ourselves before we can ask others to peel the layers back on themselves. So I think that's an important takeaway piece, is really being ready to hold up the mirror. I'm sorry.
Right, is who's setting up the school culture? Who's determining what that school culture, right? Because we're talking about schools is like, right? So, okay. So this is the working definition from SERC. Some of our colleagues created a definition of being culturally responsive. And we tend to use the word responsive instead of competent, because we don't actually believe that you can ever fully be competent when we're talking about culture, right? Because culture is always changing and shifting. So teachers who are highly aware of their own beliefs, attitudes, even values and biases and those of others. Students who are empowered to use their own cultural characteristics, experiences, and perspectives for academic success, and curriculum that engages and affirms both student and teacher's identity, cultural and experiential reference points, and worldviews in the process of learning.
If we think about students' culture, we make culture a trait of that individual based on his or her membership in a particular community, right? And so we want, and that leads us into conflating race and ethnicity with culture. So one of the first things we have to do is kind of pull apart, we don't take race off the table, right, at all, but we're really pulling apart what culture is, right, and making sure we don't conflate it, because if we do, then we make cultural practices a trait of that person's membership in that particular community. And that leads us, of course, to make very easily slip into one size fits all, that my Latino children learn this way, or my African American children need X, right? And so it's making culture a trait of the individual that's been very problematic in the implementation of culturally relevant pedagogy, right? So we want to think about much more dynamic notions of culture. And so I think one of the simple ways I would tell teachers is, how can we start thinking about culture not as a noun but as a verb? What people do in their everyday lives. So if I want to understand how a student's culture, I want to understand how they live culturally. That means, what do they do in their everyday lives? And we've really been thinking about this because I think it's really a first order question, especially for teachers, is what does it mean to do this culturally relevant pedagogy? So one of the mantras we came up with is, we want people to always think about, where is there regularity in a community that's useful for me to know? But we shouldn't make policy and we shouldn't develop curriculum based on that one lens, that regularity. We need to we need to have what I call a binocular vision, so that we use one lens to say, where's there regularity in my classroom, in this student group, in this community, and then where's variance? And then in understanding that second lens, that you start to understand that there is as much diversity, there's more diversity within groups than there is across groups, right? And so I start to develop more complex and nuanced notions of that cultural community. The difficult thing for teachers is, in an era of globalization, where there's tremendous movement of peoples, when there's more mixing of groups in terms of class, in terms of ethnicity, of race, hybridity is the order of the day. So what does it mean to do a culturally relevant pedagogy when hybridity is the order of the day in my classroom, right? And this challenges, and it should challenge us as educators to say, then maybe, what does that mean for me? How do I have to rethink this model, right? So that don't fall back into the trap of these large, broad generalizations about people, to really learning how people individually live culturally every day.
Touching upon culture, but we're also going to move a little bit into definitions around bias, because they really do, these pieces go hand in hand. So thinking about, what do we need to do to be culturally responsive? What are some 3 takeaways, some 3 things we want to ensure are part of our practices? High expectations for all students. We're going to get more into these 3 pieces, so I'm just going to quickly touch on them. Using culture and experiences in their learning. So I think of a classroom teacher where on the first day of school, we'd fill out little cards about ourselves. I like to do this. These are things I enjoy. And then they became part of her file. I still to this day have no idea how she used that information. It never came back up in discussion. So thinking about, if you're doing those type of activities, how do I use that information? How do I make it part of my instruction? How am I bringing that to the class and part of my curriculum? And then looking at teacher practices around effective instruction and adequate resources. So thinking about what Diane was talking about this morning, what are my teacher practices, opportunities to respond, high engagement, good classroom management skills. But then thinking about our system pieces, how do I have the resources to provide students with what they need? So thinking about those pieces together.
And I just want to add that sometimes folks will come to conferences, or they'll go to PD and they'll say, I need strategies for X group, right? But like Chris Gutierrez in the video was saying, cultural is like a verb, right? So it's always changing. You can't necessarily take one strategy and just use it for another group of students, right? So if you have 5 African American students in your class, and these strategies are maybe working for a particular group of students, you can't necessarily use those strategies next year or in another group. You have to make sure you're being culturally responsive to the group of students and what their particular needs might be. Does that make sense? So you have to get to know the students. You have to know what lessons are going to work for them, what interventions are going to work for them, and getting to know the students on a personal level, and using, like what Amanda was saying, if you do those sheets in the very beginning, making sure you take those types of things and talking to the students. I always say your students are your clients, essentially. The answers are in the room. If you talk to them, they're going to help you figure out how to help them, right? they will help you figure things out. So Amanda was talking about the different definitions that we were going to talk about. So overt bias, right, the conscious belief in superiority of one group, versus explicit bias, right, the conscious belief that some groups aspire to desirable traits more than others, and then implicit bias, which is that unconscious bias that's associated with some groups.
We're going to focus on implicit bias because I think oftentimes what Diane was even saying this morning is we all have it. We have judgments, we have stereotypes, we have biases that are part of, honestly, the culture that we live in. We have images that come across the TV that tell us a lot about certain people. So thinking about that we live in a world where this is part of our mantra, that's in our brains. So what do we do to be more aware of it? And how do we check our own selves to be more mindful of how does that bias, or is that a bias? So looking at, it's unconscious and it's automatic. So in a little bit, we're going to talk about vulnerable decision points, because we need to make a shift. We need to know what we're coming to the table with. Often implicit bias is based off of stereotypes and experiences. So I gave the example in the last group. I used to work with kindergarten students. I had a student on the first day of school scratch me from my wrist to my elbow pretty deep. He had an explosive behavioral incident and scratched me. Every time that I walked into the room with him, that experience played through my head. So now when I walked into the room, when I sat down next to him and I was providing some instruction to him, I was tense. I was on edge. I was ready for him to lash out on me again. That was one experience that shaped all of my future experiences with him. And unfortunately, I wasn't my best self in all of those moments because I was reacting based off of that one initial time of dealing with him. When actually now, and I think back of that little guy who's now in 6th grade, that he is a wonderful boy. He had a challenging moment, and unfortunately I was there at that moment, but he has many great skills. But that whole first year, many of my experiences with him are shaped off of that challenging time. Generally, it's not an indication of what we believe or what we would endorse. So it's something that is just kind of a natural go-to based off of many of those stereotypes and previous experiences. They're likely to influence snap decisions or decisions that are ambiguous and we're not sure how to respond. So we're going to go back to this implicit bias when we talk about vulnerable decision points. Here's a document that you can all access on pbis.org. How many of you are actually from PBIS schools that have PBIS in place? So many of the resources that we're sharing, they might say PBIS on them. I want you all to know that you don't need to be a PBIS school to benefit from the resources that are on that website. It really is about, and in 1 second, we're going to talk about the critical features. It's about what are the supports, universal supports in your school. So just because it says PBIS on it, don't shy away from it. But looking at ensuring that we have effective instruction, that we have a strong foundation of universal skills that we are teaching students. I'm going to go over that strong foundation in a moment. That we are looking at data. And I think too many times we ask folks to collect data for us and then we don't know how to use it effectively. So how are we using data to inform decision making? Are we disaggregating data and looking at race, gender, different pieces that might be impacting our decision making? We're going to talk about how that's tied to other practices. So thinking about how do we define problem behaviors in our school? So if I'm looking at students who are demonstrating disrespect, who are those students? Could it be a problem on how I'm defining disrespect? Have we included multiple perspectives in that definition? So looking at those pieces. And then the whole practice around neutralizing routines for vulnerable decision points. So I'm going to talk about that in one moment, thinking about that we all walk into the room with our own baggage. So how do we change our routine of how we respond? So core features of Tier 1. You heard Diane mention this morning, so I'm just going to quickly jump through these, but I think it's important for us to all have an understanding of what it really means to be implementing a good core Tier 1 practice around behavior for our students. We should have a team that is committed to looking at these things. Our school climate team, a PBIS team, an RTI for behavior team, an SAT team, whatever the team is, who's really looking at universally, what are we doing for all students? And when I say all, I mean all. Oftentimes, sometimes, or many times, we put special ed students in a certain bucket, or not those kids, or it'll work for most of our kids. We need to be thinking about all students when we're setting up our foundation supports. That we have faculty that are committed to doing this. They have a clear expectation of what we are asking them to do, and they're on board with us. Diane mentioned, they are also on the triangle. So we're really hoping for 80%. We're hoping for all, but we need 80% on board. I'm committed to this. We have clearly defined expectations for students that are explicitly taught and explicitly reinforced. They're not only for students, really important for them to be for staff as well. So I've worked with many schools. So if you say you are safe, respectable, and responsible, what does that mean to be for a staff member as well? So thinking about how do we break those things down. One takeaway that I think is an aha moment for many folks. How many of you are from secondary schools, middle schools, or high schools? So the idea of reinforcement can be challenging for folks, even in elementary school settings, but specifically at secondary folks, where you say, I teach English, not behavior. They should come into my building knowing how to show respect already. That shouldn't be something that I should teach. I changed the term of reward to acknowledge or reinforce. We are looking at increasing the likelihood of that behavior happening again. So it's a really important piece of the practice. Along with the explicit definition and explicitly teaching that, we need to be reinforcing it. And whatever you use as your acknowledgement system, that is really just the tangible that goes across. The verbal feedback that I'm giving is what's the most meaningful part. So having that observable statement, you're showing me respect by having great eye contact. Thank you. That is the important piece. Having clear discipline procedures, what's office managed, what's classroom managed, having a clear understanding of that with consistency and approach. So if I'm in your class and I handle this behavior this way, I know this is the consistent approach for when I go to your class, because oftentimes that's where we can see some challenges arise when there's not a consistent pattern. That we have data that we are using and disaggregating and being critical and using in our decision making. That we have clear classroom behavior systems tied to this morning. What are effective classroom behavior management systems in place? How are those being used in classrooms? What does that look like? Is there a continuum of responses for students? And the days of the zero tolerance or one late equals one detention, those days are really shifting. We have to think more restoratively. How are we building relationships? And how are we actually holding kids accountable in a way that they're learning the behavior that we're expecting them, not just punishing? That's not working. How are we evaluating what we're doing and creating a plan? This isn't a checkbox, a one and done. This is really an every year where you have to take into account all the things that we've done, what has worked well, and what do we need to tweak and move on. So thinking about how do we embed culturally relevant practices in our tiered supports. Your biggest bang for your buck is your prevention, your tier 1. What are we doing universally for students? At CERC, we often, everything that we do includes voice. We want to have family voice, we want to have student voice, we want to have community voice. Sometimes our schools are shy to open the doors to think of what is the community like outside of our school building. We want to include multiple perspectives when we're shaping our expectations, when we're building our systems, and when we're evaluating what we do. We need to honor the different multiple perspectives. So we're going to give you some tools and strategies around your definitions of behaviors, your expected behaviors, around how do you get a broader voice around that area. I mentioned your problem behavior definitions, being critical on how those are defined, thinking about who is that targeting, who isn't it. So give a quick example here around gender. I was in a school where we were looking at aggression and noncompliance, and we were getting boys, 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 but the girls' subtle noncompliance of like the eye roll or the head nod was not getting written up because that wasn't part of their definition. Yet it's just as disrespectful or noncompliant as some of the shoving the paper off the desk. So thinking very critically about how are we defining our behaviors to ensure that we're not targeting just certain students. Staff training. You don't have to raise your hand on this, but think about how much training have you gotten around cultural responsiveness, even dialogue. So we're working with some districts right now who are changing their own hiring practices around including questions of how willing are you to have conversations around race and culture, and ensuring folks who are coming to their buildings are ready to talk about these things. Again, that materials are accessible and that students are leading activities. Even as young as your elementary school, students should be involved in the process. We should be honoring their voice and using it to shape what we're doing. When we're thinking about our more advanced tiers, we need to include that families and students are part of the process. There's many schools that we will assist that will have either tier 2 meetings or they'll be coming up with behavior support plans, and the student or the family member is actually never sitting in those meetings. It's really hard to determine an intervention for a student that's going to work if you don't include their voice. Or coming up with a behavior plan and picking a replacement behavior and not asking the student, does that work for you? Is this reinforcing for you? We need to include them as part of the process. And then ensuring whatever practices and interventions that we use actually is culturally appropriate. So oftentimes many of the go-to evidence-based strategies, we need to take a critical lens. Does that make sense for the students that we're working with? So, high expectations for all students. Should we lower expectations? No. We need to ensure that we are meeting students where they're at and providing support. So I'm going to give a couple non-examples here. Think about the cycle of mistrust. What happens when we lower expectations? A student produces a poor quality work, so they don't do their best work. The teacher provides critical feedback. You could do better. Here's where you could improve this. The student perceives the feedback as racially biased. So I'm assuming here already there's not a good relationship happening. So then the student responds with a problem behavior or withdraws. So if they no longer want to do this, they do their passive noncompliance, shutting down. So then the teacher from this interaction lowers their standards and next time withholds the critical feedback. So from one experience, the teacher's going to say, ooh, I'm not going to provide that feedback anymore. From now on, whatever he turns in, I'm just going to let it happen because I don't want to see that explosion happen again. So we are lowering our expectations. Or a student produces poor quality work. The teacher overpraises the poor quality work. So, oh, thank you. You actually turned in problem 1 of your math assignment. Thanks. The student perceives that praise as insincere because for everybody else's expectation was to finish the worksheet. So then the student withdraws. So the student doesn't receive critical feedback to improve. So they're not getting the same type of high quality, high expectations for students. So how do we change this? How do we hold high expectations for all students? We want to make sure that we are clear with expectations, giving critical feedback, and then always giving, how do I support you in doing this? What do you need to meet your needs? Earlier, we talked about implicit bias and how that impacts vulnerable decision points. This could be like a whole training on itself. So I'm going to give you all a couple quick strategies so we can move on to the other tools. But I think it's an important thing to be reflective of. What is a vulnerable decision point? Have any of you ever heard that before, that term? No? Like thumbs up if yes. All right. So we all come into situations with our own baggage. So it could be our internal state. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. I have 2 children under the age of 3. Like sleep is something I wish I had. I didn't eat lunch. I ate a few pretzels and hummus quickly as I was pumping. So I'm not in my best, relaxed state of mind. I have a lot of things. I have another 2-day session tomorrow. So a lot of things are going on in my mind. These are all personal things that are going on right now. And then a situation happens. The sound's not working on my computer. I get frustrated, I get anxious, and there's a few ways I can respond. A training that I was in, we were thinking about when was you were not at your best self, and how did you respond to challenging behaviors in your classroom? So if I think about how I am right now, where I'm highly stressed with a big event, lack of sleep, I'm hungry, and I go home, and my son and my daughter are arguing. Well, she's not going to argue, but she's going to give them some sass back. I'm going to separate them. I'm going to yell at them, probably. I'm not going to use all of my PBIS and restorative practice self on how I respond right then, because I'm not in my best state of mind. And that's human. That's natural. So what do we do to change that? How can we be more reflective and mindful of what we are coming in with? What is our baggage to the situation? So in order to do this, we need to know, when are we not at our best selves? Am I tired this morning? Am I hungry? Am I annoyed? Do I have other things in my mind? We need to know also what our trigger behaviors are. Because many times that's kind of what sets us off. We can walk into our classroom and those 2 kiddos are already arguing, or kids already off task. What are those triggering behaviors that are going to lead me to not have my best self when I'm in a decision-making point? So we have to come up with a new routine. Because oftentimes what happens when we are responding in that vulnerable decision points, we're making decisions that we're not proud of later on. We either send a kid out of the classroom, we respond with a harsh no, stop, don't. We fill out an office discipline referral. We respond in not our best selves. So what can I do instead? If I know I'm walking into my classroom tired, hungry, overwhelmed, and I know behaviors are going to happen, what's something that I can do differently? So you want a quick routine, something brief, and if and then. So if Johnny starts acting out right now, what am I going to do instead? Think of stop, drop, and roll. You want a routine that you're going to build into an easy go-to strategy for yourself. It's got to be doable. So when something does happen, you need to be reflective and think, is this a vulnerable decision point for me? Am I my best self right now? And if not, I need to go to my new routine. Let me give you an example here. So this is a lack of positive relationship with the students. There hasn't been a lot of good praise happening already. The teacher's fatigued. So we're starting off the day with, we haven't even had a good morning. How are you? Check in. I'm tired. So then the student loudly complains about the work. Oh, I hate math. Why are we doing math already? I'm tired. I'm fatigued. I haven't had any interactions with the student yet. I'm going to say, you know what? We don't use that language in my class. Go to my buddy teacher's room. So the student leaves the class and is able to escape the activity. Where is the vulnerable decision point here? When can you do something differently? Yep. Mm-hmm. Perfect. So she's saying to change up what our response is. So instead of sending the student to the office, we have to have a different routine there. I'm going to say there's also some other things that you could do differently as far as prevention strategies of setting up some positive interactions with that student to start. But if that doesn't happen, so if I'm having a tough day and I'm not doing my typical morning routine of greeting and getting to know you, I need to have a different strategy for when behavior occurs.
I think it's also important to kind of address that. A lot of people look at the behavior component as the student behavior. It's not the student behavior. It's the adult behavior. It's how are we responding to what the student has already put out there. So we're actually in an ABC kind of model ourselves as adults.
Perfect. So what she's saying is the behavior, we have to be more reflective of adult behavior, and I'm going to have you come to a training with me tomorrow. Because you're right. The ABC contingency is really about adult behavior. So I'm going to change this language up a little bit. What do I do to prevent? What do I do to teach? And what do I do to respond? And those are adult behaviors, because the reality is I can't change you, but I can change how I respond to those situations. I saw another. Yep. Modeling. Mm-hmm. Yep. Perfect. So some of that is modeling our own strategies, letting people know up front that I've had a rough day. I do another training around social emotional learning and explicit skill instruction to students. We need to model those things ourselves. We're adults. We make mistakes. Even if I respond this way, when the student comes back, I'm going to say, you know what? I was really overtired and I probably shouldn't have sent you out of the office. Let's have a chat about what happened, and honoring our own mistakes. But the reality is we need to come up with a different routine. If we know we're not our best selves, what can we do instead? So instead of the go-to, that's it, go to the office, that's it, go to the buddy room, I'm going to say, come see me after class. Something else I just want to quickly honor with this is students oftentimes have the time to do some self-reflection. We give them a natural type break of go to the office, go to the buddy room, take a walk. Teachers don't have this luxury. So I'm looking at more of the administrator folks. When do we build in for a teacher to be self-reflective of their own behaviors? Because it's hard this happens so quickly and we're quickly back into instruction. So how do I, as a teacher, know, gosh, when I said that, or when I walked up close to Johnny and touched him on the shoulder and then he set off and then I sent him to the office, maybe my proximity, maybe my touch, maybe my tone. So we need to build in some system pieces and some practices around supporting staff to be reflective. Administrators can also use this piece around how do we handle problem behaviors without the one lens. So sometimes the systems we have in place, like an office discipline referral, that tells one side of the story. So ensuring that we are getting multiple perspectives, we're actually asking students what happened from their perspective, that we are looking at relationships, ensuring that if there's not a good student-teacher relationship, how do we actually build that? We can't repair that without building it first. So many of us are rushing to some strategies without thinking about how do I build a relationship first. And then looking at teaching is always needs to be our go-to first. So the punishment piece of a detention or an expulsion or, an after school, whatever, isn't going to change behavior. We have to think about the explicit teaching of the skills that are missing. I don't know if I mentioned it in my intro, but I'm also a restorative practices trainer. But I think a good takeaway, even for classroom teachers, this doesn't have to be an administrative chat, but it's really about getting students to think more about how did this impact me? How did this impact others? But the huge piece of this is relationships need to be there first. So how are we building relationships to then be able to have some of this dialogue? And if you look carefully at the wording, there's changes. It's not what can you do differently? What can we do differently? I watched a teacher who did an activity where she started with just a what could you do differently tomorrow? And then her next question is what could we do differently? And I was like, why did she ask both of these? But it was such an interesting perspective. The student shared, I shouldn't sit next to Johnny, or when Johnny smacks his gum during math class, it's really hard for me to pay attention. If I would just ask, what did you do differently? I would have never known about this gum smacking that could have changed behavior as well. So this also comes from that document. Again, we could go on, and I think we've mentioned many of these really important pieces. Looking critically at data, ensuring that we have multiple perspectives and voice, looking at supporting environment prevention strategies is your biggest bang for your buck. No matter what you put on the back end of your alternative discipline strategy or your reactive strategy, if you don't have relationships in a tier 1 to build it off, it's not going to work. So let's get into some of the activities. All of these are going to be they are on the website, but I'm going to put a couple more on, but this one specifically is. So you were given a handout as you walked in. So if you want to take it out, you're going to look at the first row. This is an activity you can do first yourself, because remember, we need to be reflective of our own culture, our own biases, our own perspectives, but also looking at working with your staff, working with your families, working with your students. So thinking about different elements of culture, you could change what is on the horizontal columns into any of those pieces that were on the iceberg, but thinking about what are some elements of culture? What were your values growing up? What are your values now? What is my school value about that? Do we have any explicit rules or protocols in place around those? How my students and families might be different, and how this difference might create conflict. So if I could just have you do the first row, a quick kind of jot down of appropriate personal space. Anybody willing to share what was your value growing up about personal space?
About appropriate personal space. That I was taught that I don't come up to a person and just like hug them, that I keep this kind of distance when speaking to someone. And that's something that even has come over kind of in my professional life, that I don't talk to people here, I talk to people here.
Oh no, I'm a hugger. I grew up in a household of very close. There wasn't a such thing as personal space. I'm a toucher. So thinking about those differences. What about your school? What are schools typically set up around personal space? No touching? Yeah. Younger? You said younger students? The younger the student, the more no touching. So thinking about, what was that? No displays of affection. So you guys are all, I'm going to quickly share a personal story. I have a almost 3-year-old son, sent him to preschool for the first time. So I said, I'm from a hugging family. We hug all the time. We do a lot of kissing too. He sits on my lap to read stories. We're lots of intimate space. I got a email home from the classroom teacher that they were working with Cameron on personal space. And I was like, well, developmentally, is that like even appropriate for 3-year-olds? But okay. But he was going to a Montessori school where they valued independence. They valued personal space. They actually worked on like little mats to really define where their space was. Really hard for Cameron. And so my first go-to for the teacher, because I think about that difference created a lot of conflict for him because he was getting in trouble all the time for hugging and kissing children and the teacher. So it was hard. So I said to her, are you explicitly teaching him about personal space? Like, he needs to be taught. He cannot sit on your lap, hug a friend, kiss a friend. And I can't teach him that at home because at home, that's completely appropriate. So thinking really, the big takeaway here is if we are expecting something different from what it looks like at home or in the community or a different value, we need to be explicitly defining that and teaching that at school, because that's where we want the behavior to happen. And I think sometimes we just assume these things. Like if I put up on the board, hands and feet to self, hands and feet to self. It's very different. I need to be explicitly taught. What does that mean? And reinforce for that. So please, you could take this back, use this with folks, be reflective on your own self. Also very interesting to think about your own school's values around those pieces. Yep. You're getting there for me. Thank you. You're going to come up and present with me. You're good. She said we're teaching kids to code switch. And yes, that's one way to think about it, but I'm going to have us push a little bit in a moment about that as well, because it's not just about code switching. We also have to honor that difference. So quick strategy. Would you be willing to try this out, filling out that sheet? Thumbs up, thumbs to the side, not so sure, thumbs down. And do you think it would improve staff's cultural awareness? Do you think it would help them kind of peel back some layers? None of these tools as a standalone, none of these tools as a standalone will do it. It's really about how do we build a culture of being reflective, looking at our practices, and for it to be important. So you mentioned the code switching. How many of you have behavior matrices with your behaviors defined? What they look like, operationally defined. So here's an example of stay safe, show respect, try our best. We have those defined at school. This is what we want to see. Oftentimes we define these things in a box as adults thinking about what behaviors we want. I'm asking in this activity for us to take a different spin on that. So this is a tool you can use to have students complete or families complete. What does it mean to stay safe, show respect, try your best, or whatever your school expectations are at home? And what does it look like in the community? This can open up dialogue for code switching that I think of like stay safe, keep your hands and feet to self. At home, rough play, like when I watch my husband and my son together, like it's hands on, he's throwing him up, they're pushing each other. But that behavior is acceptable at home. Not at school. So we can have some honest conversations about the code switching. But then how can we also honor some of those definitions and how we define them? How can we either make it appropriate for some locations? How can we broaden our definitions? How can we maybe make a tweak in our definition? So it's a two-way street. It's not just saying to kids, oh, I get that there's a difference, but too bad at school you got to do this. There might be some of those must-dos, but then how can we also take some of their definitions and build it into our definition, create more of an inclusive practice? I thought it was interesting. A participant from our last session said they surveyed staff on what did they see the definitions of disrespect and their common behavior definitions are, or how did they define them? And they got very wide variety in definitions. And then she's like, I'd love to see if we could actually survey the students too. Because just because you've done this activity once and it's in your handbook doesn't mean that the work is done. We have to constantly be talking about it. And then also, when we said using your data, does this definition work? Do folks actually know how we've defined it? But I think this is a great way to include dialogue from our families and also bring that message back. When we said accessible to families, I worked with many families who would have loved to know, A, what the expectations were at school, and then how could they align with what they're doing at home? How do I use this language at home with my child? So how likely would you be to try it out? To do this activity? Have your kiddos fill it out, your families fill it out. Do you think it would improve cultural awareness? Again, it's about how you use the information. I give this example. I do an FBA BIP training, and I have many folks who say they have students fill out think sheets when they misbehave. And I say, oh, that's a great consequence strategy. However, how do you use that think sheet? It's not the act of completing it. The most useful piece of something is how do I take the information somebody just gave me and next time use it? So if a student fills out a think sheet and says, next time I will do this, I need to build it into my routine to prompt that behavior, reinforce that behavior, make sure it's not just the act of doing it. So it's not just the act of filling out this matrix, it's using the information in your practice. A few resources. If you are a PBIS school officially trained, there is this assessment tool called the Tiered Fidelity Inventory that looks at your multi-tiered systems of support. If you've been officially trained and would like to get the TFI through another resource, please come see me. But there's also a companion guide that looks at cultural responsiveness within your tiers of support. And I'm going to even say I've used the TFI in non-PBIS schools. It is about critical features of your multi-tiered system support. So whether you're PBIS or not, really looking at what are the critical components of your tiers of support. And this companion guide also takes a critical lens looking at cultural responsiveness, and they have another companion guide around restorative practices as well. Another document around the 5-point intervention to enhance equity in school discipline. I want us all to not be so reactive though. Whenever I see discipline up on the form, up on the screen, I want us to think more about prevention, early intervention. How are we doing this to be more proactive on the front end so we don't have to be so reactive on the back end? Other acknowledgements. There's a New England PBIS website that has great training materials, and then the national site of pbis.org. And then for some reason, half my contact information is cut off, but you have my email and phone, which are the best pieces, and Nicole's information. Please take the information from the website back to others. Please fill out the evaluation. But we want to hear from you all. Questions, things you've done, strategies you've used, where you could use some help. Now's your chance. Thank you for taking a risk.
So I work in New Haven Public Schools, and I've been there for a really long time. And I would like to know, so you were talking about we were talking about the code switching and things like that. And that is definitely something that I address with my students. Okay, that's okay at home, but maybe that's not okay at school. But, and I get the matrix that you use. So how do I do a better job at respecting it, you know what I mean? And being sensitive to it, but still sending that message that somehow, I'm kind of stuck, I guess is my question.
I'm not the knowledge owner. So I think of what have folks used. So I think that's a real, yep. Yep. So how do we address code switching? How do we build relationship with a student instead of shutting it down?
So back in the day when I was a building-based administrator, one of the things that we did was, you would have those different types of celebrations. And so that allowed us to have a platform to kind of talk about cultural differences and what have you been taught in your home that's okay to do in your home versus what you're now saying is okay to do in a classroom. And there's nothing bad about the home behaviors. They're wonderful, and we want to, embrace those and celebrate those. But just like in any other situation, sometimes I refer to going into a job situation, that when your mom goes to work, the hugging and kissing that she might do with her family at home, she doesn't go to work and do that with her boss. A little awkward, right? So, but putting it in that type of format so the student gets to see that there's a big difference between what's acceptable in one environment versus what isn't. Yeah, even to going to things like
But I think we did kind of talk it out in a way that, dancing, fair reaction, at home, but school,
something more basic, like what one group of folks may wear to church, your church clothes versus your place clothes. So taking it down that low for the little people, because they can get that difference. I don't dress the same way I do, when I go out to play as I might when I'm going to visit grandma, or if I'm going to a wedding, or if I'm going to someone's special birthday event.
I think what I've seen work well as well is having the matrix be a beginning of the year activity. So we set up our classroom expectations together, and we honor kind of some of those changes, and we build in what we can, and then using some of even those restorative questions. So when something does happen, hey, so I know you were really excited and you got up and danced and you got that right, but how did that affect your learning? And being able to get some of that classroom community as part of the dialogue.
I think it depends on the culture of the students, their age group that you're working with. I've gone from Head Start to high school, and at Head Start, culturally for some, touch. And if somebody touched you, the males in their household were telling the boys the next day to go back and do the same thing, and the moms were flipping out. So, and then reverting back now to with high school, with kids, and even because I have kids with autism, they want to dance and celebrate. Telling them when that is appropriate, not just at home. At school, we can take that time. Like I will take a kid out in the hall. We'll both do the dance. You can do it not in the lunchroom, but maybe recess. So again, with that whole, one solution doesn't fit all. It's the same with you're respecting their cultural difference, but giving them a time, maybe, because it doesn't only have to be at home. I think we're stifling that. And I find, with a lot of kids, I was in a bilingual school, and when you're forcing them to like switch and change with the language, because at home, that's all they speak. So there isn't any right or wrong with the cultural differences, just recognizing how old the kid is and then putting it. And I love the examples that she used about church clothes and versus, parents at work hugging and kissing, other people. You run home and tell daddy, mommy just,
So in closing, please feel free to reach out. This unfortunately isn't it all. And again, and there's no one tool that's going to say, oh, now you're culturally responsive and now you've got it right. It really is about how do we embed these strategies in everything we do, multiple perspectives, using data, ensuring voice. Please feel free to reach out to Nicole and I. Please access materials from the website and share them with others. And please fill out the evaluation as we are building kind of next steps. It's really a helpful tool. So thank you all for coming today. I hope you are all able to walk out with one thing that you can bring back and do differently.